The wind swept across the flats in long, dusty sighs, making the steel targets hum and the flags droop on their poles. Spectators shielded their eyes and leaned over one another as the final Marine's rifle cracked. A moment later, the spotter called it just outside the scoring ring. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the bleachers, the kind people used when they weren't sure it was safe to laugh. No one wanted to mock Marines for missing. Near the vendor tent, a woman in a faded navy ball cap set down a tray of paper cups. Her arms were thick and strong, the kind built for carrying lumber, not serving drinks. A smudge of grease marked the corner of one thumbnail. When the captain barked, "Next," and no one stepped forward, she raised a finger. "Sir," she said calmly, "may I borrow your rifle?" Heads turned. The captain's mouth curled into a smirk. The spotter blinked. The crowd sensed something unfolding and pressed closer, phones rising like a sudden forest of glass. She wasn't tall. Her hair was braided and tucked beneath her cap. Along her right knuckle ran a pale, nearly invisible scar, the kind left by a rifle bolt that bites once and is never forgotten. Before we go on, remember to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true accounts of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Tessa Rowan lived by rhythm, not routine. Every morning, before the town fully woke, she ran the narrow path tracing the dry curve of the river. The early air carried a brief chill, just enough to clear her mind before the heat took over. Her stride was steady, unhurried. She didn't run for fitness or pride. She ran because movement kept the silence from becoming too loud. At 35, she worked 6 days a week at Sierra Vista Hardware, a squat concrete building with a sun-bleached sign and a single bell that chimed whenever the door opened. The scent of oil, dust, and fresh-cut lumber clung to everything, including her. Customers came in asking about pipe fittings, door hinges, and ammunition boxes, never realizing the woman behind the counter understood ballistics better than they understood their own toolkits. Her hands told the story to anyone who looked closely. Steady, powerful, marked by fine scars and old burn lines. Hands that once gripped a rifle stock instead of a broom handle. No one asked. She never offered. Years ago, Tessa had been a quiet presence on the state marksmanship. Circuit precise, disciplined, never flashy. She later worked briefly as a civilian consultant on a military base, helping instructors refine wind calibration techniques for small arms. Then came the accident. A training error that ended a soldier's career and left her with a scar across her knuckle and a silence she couldn't escape. When the investigation ended, she left without protest. No statements. No bitterness. She folded that part of her life away and moved to Sierra Vista with her mother. Anne Rowan was gentle. Walking with a slight limp from years spent on her feet as a nurse, she filled their modest home with plants that somehow survived the desert air and never pressed her daughter with questions. Their small, peeling house was quiet in a way that felt natural. It's not heavy. Tessa owned very little, no jewelry, no expensive furniture. Her only indulgence was a worn rifle cleaning kit hidden beneath her workbench. On quiet Sundays, when the wind made running impossible, she'd take it out, polish the brushes, oil the rods, then put it all away untouched. Ritual, not preparation. Her boss, Red Dale, a retired Air Force mechanic, recognized competence when he saw it. He ran the store with military precision and never pride. But he noticed things. Watching Tessa handle calibration tools or balance a level one-handed, he'd shake his head and mutter, "You don't belong behind this counter forever." She'd smile and keep sorting nails. Marines from the nearby base came in often young, loud, confident. She listened quietly until one mentioned a scope problem or mounting issue. Then she'd offer a single, measured sentence. If it's pulling left, check the recoil lug before touching the zero.
Ow!
Sometimes they laughed and ignored her. But some came back later, sheepish grins in place. "Ma'am, that fixed it." "How'd you know?" She'd shrugged. "Lucky guess." The week of the fundraiser, Corporal Briggs stopped in for thread locker and cleaning patches. Polite, nervous in the way new Marines often were. "We're shooting this weekend," said. "Fundraiser match? You running optics or irons? She asked. He blinked. We've had drift. You shoot? Used to, she replied, something final in her tone. He studied her hands, the way shooters do, measuring steadiness. You sure sound like you still do? She didn't answer. That night, she scrolled through the event notice on her phone. Veterans Rehabilitation Fundraiser. Free admission. Donations encouraged. She planned to stop by briefly, drop some cash. Maybe help serve water. Her mother noticed the hesitation. You thinking of going? Maybe you love those ranges. I loved what came before them, Tessa said softly. The calm before the first shot, the silence just before the trigger breaks. Saturday morning came hot and bright. By 9, the range buzzed with noise, laughter, and gun oil. Kids waved souvenir flags. Vendors sold lemonade. Rifles cracked across the flats. Tessa stayed near the vendor tent, handing out cups. Just another volunteer. But beneath the calm, she felt it. The pattern forming. Drift, heat, misalignment. The old instincts stirred as the temperature climbed. Shots began sliding right. Adjustments were made. Misses followed. Frustration crept into every movement. She stepped closer to the captain. Sir, it might be your mounts. They're pulling right as the barrel heats. He glanced at her, unimpressed. Hardware tips won't save marine rifles. She nodded and stepped back. Then came the worst miss. Steel rang wrong. Silence followed. Next. The captain barked. No one moved. Tessa set down her tray. Wiped grease from her thumb. Sir, she said calmly. May I borrow your rifle? The captain laughed. You think you can outshoot Marines? No, sir. I think I can show you why they're missing. The range fell silent. She adjusted the bipod with practiced ease. The scar on her knuckle caught the light. The spotter frowned. He recognized the movements. When she lay behind the rifle, the world seemed to pause. She read the wind, not waiting for it, mapping it. The first shot rang out. Clank, dead center, no cheers. Just stunned silence. She reset, breathed. Clank. Again, asterisk, one by one, the plates rang true. Not luck, not magic, just mastery reclaimed. And in that stillness, every Marine watching understood. It's the same thing. She wasn't there to prove herself. She was there to remind them what excellence looks like. Asterisk, the rifle answered her like a conversation, not a shove. Recoil came and went in a rhythm she understood. Good, good, the spotter murmured, his voice steady now. He glanced at the captain, then returned to the glass. She waited through a brief lull in the wind. The computer asked for a full click. She gave it half. Numbers could be correct and still be wrong. If you didn't listen to the air, clank 9, clank 10. The 10th hit pulled a thread through the crowd. Anticipation braided itself with doubt. No way, someone whispered. Wait, said another. She heard none of it. She heard the flags, the faint hiss of sand brushing the bench, like .clank, .11, 12. 13, the spotter didn't speak to anyone in particular. She's reading the wind, not the data. It wasn't criticism. It was relief, the sound of faith being found again. A fly circled the table, then drifted toward shade. Ice cracked inside a cooler. A volunteer forgot to pour. 14. 15, her breathing never rushed. She didn't chase the trigger. Each press surprised her just enough to stay honest. The captain's posture softened in small betrayals, shin forward, weight shifting, hands unsure where to rest. He watched her right hand, then her left. As if the answer might be hiding in one of them, clank asterisk. 16. 17, she gave a hair more left and held the brake half a second longer, waiting out a shimmer that wanted to lie. The plate rang back, almost apologetic. Clank. 18. Someone laughed once. Too loud, the sound people make to relieve pressure in their chest. No one hushed him. The moment handled that. 19. 20. The count began to take shape in the air. Not large, but unmistakable in direction. She blinked once to wet her eye and never lost the view. A grain of dust drifted from her lashes on its own 20-1. The spotter slid his notebook closer but didn't write. The targets were doing the recording 20-2, 23, 20-4. The wind turned petty again. She smiled at the corner of her mouth, recognizing an old joke. The far flag flicked, then paused. She pressed through the pause, not the flick. Clank. 20-5. In the stands. A man wearing a Korea cap removed it and held it at his knee. Not ritual. Just respect for craft. 20-6, 27. She shifted her elbow a finger's width and rested her shoulder between cycles. The rifle accepted the courtesy. Clank. 20-8. The range officer stopped watching the plate. He watched her. The plate was only yes or no. She was the work. 20-9. 30 phones lifted higher. Someone whispered about her hands and zoomed in on the scar like it held a key. She settled the rifle a whisper deeper into her shoulder to counter the day's slow fatigue. The sun didn't relent. She didn't ask it. 2.30-1. The captain removed his sunglasses and hooked them on his collar. His eyes weren't hostile now. They were young. 30-2, 30-3. The spotter finally wrote something, not a correction, but a sentence to remind himself later that patience is a weapon. 30-4, 30-5. She sipped half a breath, touched her tongue to the back of her teeth. Her pulse stayed in its lane. 30-6, 30-7. The heat lifted slightly. She felt it in her cheekbone and gave a thought of a correction. It's not even a click. 30-8. 30-9.40 arrived quietly, like a cat walking the length of a fence and declining to mention the dogs below. The audience began to understand how narrow the board was, how steady the steps. Clank. 40. She allowed herself the smallest exhale, not relief, just acknowledgement. The system was working. 40-1, 42, 40-3. The spotter shifted his stance carefully, as if sudden movement might break a law of physics. 40-4. The calculator suggested something bold. She ignored it. Machines average. Flags confess. 40-5. A teenage girl lowered her phone, eyes shining, wanting to remember it raw. Her father didn't tell her to raise it again. 40-6, 40-7. The wind flirted with mischief. She listened, then answered. The conversation stayed civil. 40-8. The range officer's voice had taken on a cadence that almost sounded like prayer. Gratitude has its own music. 40-9. Between shots, she let her shoulder drop a millimeter and rise again. The rifle appreciated the courtesy. The captain gripped the bench. No smirk remained. Only truth. 50. No one cheered. The silence was doing finer work. She paused long enough to drink air, not from doubt, but from respect for distance. Sweat traced her temple. The spotter finally spoke a full sentence. Her hold is 3 parts flag, 1 part mirage. She's trusting the trough dust for timing. Downrange. The plate swayed and settled. The ring in its paint was neat as a coin. She reset her finger. No tremor, no rush. Mockery slipped out the back. Awe took its seat. A lieutenant colonel 2 rows back, watched the way you watch a sunrise. You didn't plan to catch. She adjusted her grip not from doubt, but comfort. Stock and body became a single line again. A dust devil died well left of the targets. She didn't grant it a glance. The rifle gathered itself like breath. Side metal. Each press was a promise kept. She's reading the wind. Not the data, the spotter said, again this time as a lesson. By 50. Belief had replaced doubt. She didn't look up. Didn't accept the crown the moment offered. She stayed with flags and dust in the thin place between breath and break. This wasn't performance. It was a conversation with distant sand. She had waited along. Time to speak. The steel rang again. Clean, certain, unforced. Heads turned. Not to joke, but to confirm reality. Yes, it's still happening. A man with silver oak leaves stood slowly. Authority made space without asking. He watched her hands. The elbow. The reset. The patience, Rowan, he said softly, testing a memory. The air tightened. Benning. MU. Wind clinics. Mirage. Bolt bite. The story moved through the stands like shade. She wasn't lucky. She wasn't new. She was the quiet professional who had trained the trainers. Recognition completed its circuit. Another hit. Another breath. By 98, the crowd was no longer outside the sound. They were inside at 90-9. One round left. She loaded it carefully. Read the wind one last time. The far flag dipped. It's almost polite. Clank. 101. The sound lingered like a church. Bell in heat. Then the bleachers erupted, not chaos, but reverence. The lieutenant colonel saluted. Then another, and another. The captain followed last. Humility finally settled where pride had been. She rose calmly, dust on her sleeves. Face steady. Thank you, the colonel said softly. Just physics, she replied. You taught the rest. Ceasefire was called, though the range had already gone still. Hats came off. Wind returned. Steel hummed in the distance. She set the rifle down gently. Bolt open, and stepped away as the crowd parted without being told. Some heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. They don't need to. Skill, honor, and discipline don't fade. They wait, and when the world finally listens, they speak not loudly, not for show, but true.